Do you remember the first movie you saw? Or maybe the first one that really stuck with you? Mine was 1994. And Disney released an animated movie called The Lion King. Classic story of good versus evil. And as a young child, I love it. In fact, I love it so much that Disney is remaking it this year in 2019. And I will probably be there to see it the first night it opens. But in this movie, The Lion King, you have a lion cub named young Simba. And Simba's father is Mufasa, and he is the king of all the Pride Land. And then a tragedy strikes when Mufasa's brother, Scar, orchestrates some events leading to Mufasa's death. And now, all of a sudden, this kingdom that's good is in the hands of a new evil king. Well, Simba blames himself for his father's death, and he finds himself running away and trying to find who he is and what he must do and how he must live. And after wasting years of his life in exile, he returns to rightfully claim what is his, the heir to the throne. An internal struggle is there, and Simba must decide, who am I going to be in the midst of this evil time? See, in the same way, in Daniel chapter 1, we find Daniel not a young lion cub, but a young man. And his whole life he has lived in the kingdom of God's people, the kingdom of Judah. But then all of a sudden things change. And this kingdom is ransacked by the evil empire Babylon. And no longer is Daniel in a place that he's familiar with, in a place that he's comfortable with. He finds himself in the midst of adversity, in the midst of struggle, and he really must decide, like young Simba, what is my response going to be? What is my response going to be? What would young Daniel do? And what can we learn from his story today? I invite you to turn with me to Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1. We'll read the text together. This is in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature of the language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of this time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food, or the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. The chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king? Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs has assigned over to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this manner, and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill and all understanding and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. It's a story that may be familiar to you. A story that you may have studied in Bible school. But it's a story full of action, a story full of intrigue. And this story can be divided into 3 scenes. In the first scene, we see God's kingdom. The kingdom of Yahweh. Now it's in the hands of the Babylonians, of Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 1 says that it was besieged. That Jerusalem was besieged. God's city, where God's temple was, now is in the hands of the enemy. And they don't just besiege the temple. They don't just besiege the city of Jerusalem. But what you see in this passage is, look, they begin to take young men from their homes. Fathers ripped from their sons. Mothers ripped from their sons. Can you imagine it? This isn't a goodbye when their kid goes off to college. This is the enemy coming in and taking what they want. Taking who they want. Goodbyes are hard. But I'm sure this goodbye was especially difficult. We see that they have no respect for God's house. They take the holy vessels of God and they bring them into the house of their own God, mocking God's people. And then with the youths that they steal, they didn't just bring them and make them slaves. No, they wanted to crush their spirits and crush their national pride. So they began to allow them to join in the ranks of young Babylonian men. And they were going to retrain them to be servants of their king. They were going to change who they were at their very core. You see, they even changed their names. You're no longer John Mark. You are this. You're no longer Sam. You are this. You're no longer Daniel. You are Belteshazzar. They're trying to change everything about them. And this culture is pressing these young youths to follow the Babylonian way. You see, it's almost like it's seen in the text as a blessing. These are youths without blemish. In other words, Daniel and his friends were strong. They were good looking. And they were giving the blessings that people could dream of. They ate the king's food. They learned the king's schools. But remember who's teaching. Remember, this is the pagan kingdom of Babylon. And it would go against the rule of a reign of the true king, God. But we got to see something in this passage. It's found in verse 2. You see, we can look at this scene, we can look at this narrative, and we can think it's out of control. We can think that it's out of control, that God's lost it, that His people are now given into Babylon's rule and reign, and that Babylon took control of Judah and Jerusalem and God's people. But notice that is not what happened. The Hebrew word in verse 2 says that it was the Lord who gave Jehoiakim. It was the Lord who gave Judah. It was the Lord who gave Jerusalem into the hands of the Babylonians. God is in control. Why would he do that? It goes way back to a promise he made his people in Leviticus. He said, if you follow me, you'll receive blessings, but if you turn away from me, then I will give you into the hands of other nations. You see, I don't want you to see this and think that, oh, everything was lost, that God had lost his people and lost control. No, we see that it was the Lord who was in control of this whole situation. See, God gave Judah into the hands of the Babylonians. But now where does that leave us with young Daniel? We don't know a lot of background information about him. We do, just because of years and time frame, believe that he grew up under the reign of King Josiah, a king who returned the people back to God's kingdom, God's rule, God's reign through the Word of God. We see that was lost in Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim turned away from that and led the people astray. But Daniel, because of his age, he remembered, obviously, God's plan. He remembered that he was a God-fearer, a God-follower. And now he finds himself in exile. And the question is, what is he going to do about it? What is he going to do about it? And that brings us to the next segment of this story. We meet a eunuch of the king, a servant of the king named Ashpenaz. And Ashpenaz is in charge of Daniel, and he's supposed to give Daniel the king's food. He's supposed to give Daniel the king's drink. He's supposed to give Daniel all that Daniel needed to thrive in the kingdom. But here's the deal. To follow the king, Nebuchadnezzar, would have been to go away from the king, God. And so Daniel has a choice to make. And we see Daniel is wise. We see Daniel is very wise. He goes and he begins to meet with Ashpenaz. And he gives Ashpenaz a test. He says, hey, I want to live this way. I want to be different than the rest of the people around me. So if you'll just test me. Just test me and my buddies for 10 days. Just 10 days, Ashpenaz. And it's one of those things, I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse, right? And so Ashpenaz says, for 10 days, okay, Daniel, I will let you do it. I'll let you do it. Daniel says that I want water and I want vegetables. And so for 10 days, Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah, otherwise known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we're given this diet. We're given this diet. And here's the deal, folks. 10 days later, they stood before Ashpenaz. And it worked. It worked. It worked. They were better in appearance. That's what my wife says about me, that you're better in appearance. I'm just kidding. They were better in appearance than all those around them. And Ashpenaz is like, whoa. It works. So he allows Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah to continue eating this way. To continue drinking this way. It's the proverbial, the proof was in the pudding. I don't want to eat the Big Macs of King Nebuchadnezzar. I don't want to eat the steak dinner. I don't want to eat this. Because I'm gonna live this way, Ashpenaz. Just try it. See if it works. And it did. Daniel was that kid at the playground or that kid in class that obviously it seems like he could just talk the teacher into doing whatever he wanted. Well, no, that's not who Daniel was. You see, we can read this section and we can think, well, Daniel was wise and Daniel used his own ability and his own strength to convince Ashpenaz to let him do that. But we must look at the text. We must look at the text. You see, in verse 8, we see something about Daniel, something about these young men that were different, obviously, than others. It says that Daniel resolved in his self that he would not defile himself with the king's food. You see that word resolve, it literally means to make a decision beforehand, to put it in your heart that you are going to do something. So before he was even tempted, before he was even tested to go away from God and to go along with the crowd, Daniel had decided, I'm following God. I'm following God. Resolved in his heart. He didn't want to be defiled. That word defiled, it means impure. It is the idea of being dirty. And you can see that used throughout the Old Testament. He didn't want to be defiled. He had made the decision in his heart. Okay, so John Mark, you're saying that Daniel's the one that did it all. But notice who's still in control. Verse 2, we see it was God who gave the kingdom into Nebuchadnezzar's rule. But then look at verse 9. Same Hebrew word. God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. See, it wasn't Daniel's witty plan. It wasn't his charming appearance. It wasn't who he was that gained that for himself. It was God who gave him favor. It was God who gave him compassion in Ashpenaz's sight. It was God who was in control. So we find God's people in the midst of exile. Young men ripped from their families, but staying firm on the ways of the Lord. But they still have to go before the king. Remember the text says that after 3 years they would go and stand before the king. So they may have convinced Ashpenaz, they may have convinced other people, but they still had to stand before the king. Can you imagine getting that knock? It's your turn. It's your turn, Daniel. And Daniel has known for a few years now, he has gone against the ruling of King Nebuchadnezzar. But he has to go now and stand in appearance. And he had to be tested in his knowledge. He had to be tested physically against many other men. Here. It's your turn, Daniel. It's your turn, Daniel. So Daniel gets up and he's with his friends, and they may have fooled Ashpenaz, but it's almost like that substitute teacher mentality. You can fool the sub a lot, but now the real teacher's there and he's going to observe. But the text tells us that they stood before the king. And look at what it says. It says that none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. It says, in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in his kingdom. So they weren't just better than the exiles. They weren't just better than the youths that were brought in with them. No, after these few years in the king's learning, in the king's kingdom, There was none like them that was serving the king. There was none like them. And the temptation is to say, well, man, Daniel did a really good job. Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, they did awesome. They excelled. Look at what they did. But that's not what the text says. See, the consistent verb throughout this passage is that verb gave. Verse 17, we see it repeated for the third time. It says, as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill. God gave them understanding. God gave Daniel the ability to understand dreams. God blessed their physical appearance so that there was none like them. God is in control. And these 4 young men who resolved in their heart, who had put it in their hearts, I do not want to be defiled. I do not want to be made dirty. I do not want to be made unclean. I want to follow the Lord. I want to follow His ways. These men that have resolved that in their hearts. God gave them favor and compassion. God gave them confidence to stand before the king. And God gave them favor in the king's sight. You see, beloved, we see this passage, and the temptation is to say, well, everything is lost. It's all out of control. But what we see in this passage is this, that God is sovereign and in control over every circumstance. And because of that, we can trust Him in the midst of any situation we face. God is sovereign and in control of every situation. And because of that, we can trust Him in any circumstances we face. Daniel, ripped from his home, placed in the evil kingdom of Babylon, was told, we're going to assimilate you to our culture and change everything about you. But Daniel said, no. I know my God is in control. And I'm going to follow Him even in the face of this adversity. See, in our culture today, our life can seem uncertain sometimes. Often, as believers, we feel like exiles in a strange world. We have the decision. Are we going to follow the kingdom of Babylon, the world around us? Or are we going to follow Yahweh, God, and His Word? And in the same way, Daniel resolved in his heart, I can trust God and I can follow His ways and I know He will be with me. We have to make that decision. Because God is in control, I can trust Him and know that He's going to be with me. See, in our sinfulness, our proneness to wonder, we must trust God. How does that look for you today? You know, maybe you're here today and you don't know this God that I speak of. Maybe you're here today and you're in exile to your own sin. Just as Daniel was shackled in Babylon and brought in and now in control of the kingdom of Babylon, you are part of the kingdom of this world and you've never been set free. You say, John Mark, I don't know all this stuff, but I feel like my life is a wreck and I don't know what to do. Here's what you can do today. You can realize that there is a true King, Jesus, who will set you free. And even in the midst of all that you're facing, you can turn to Him. Because He came to pay for your sins so that you might have life, so that you can live for Him in the midst of trying circumstances. If you're here today and you don't know Christ, if you're here today and you don't know this God that I speak of, this God who is sovereign and in control, today can be that day by turning to Jesus. Or maybe you're here today and you're a father who's struggling to provide for his family. Things aren't going well at your job. The paychecks aren't coming in as it should be. And financially, you are a mess. And it's been making you doubt. It's making you fear. It's consuming who you are. Well, today I want you to hear this, my brother, that God is in control. That just as Daniel resolved in his heart to trust in the Lord and to walk in His ways, do not cut corners. Do not go away from the Lord, but seek Him in this time and trust Him to be your rock. Or maybe you're a young girl. Maybe you're a teenager here this morning whose family's in shambles. You don't even want to go home because your mom and your dad, they fight all the time. Home is not a refuge for you. Home itself is exile. And you've thought about thoughts that you don't even want to think of, running away or taking your own life because the circumstances around you seem to be unfaceable. Remember today that God is in control. That He is not taken by surprise. That no matter what you face, He promises to be with you. And that if you resolve in your heart to trust Him, to follow Him, He will never leave you or forsake you. Whatever your situation is today, when you don't know where to turn, we can always look to our Father. I remember as a young boy, I got lost in the grocery store. I was in Walmart. I was a little chubby fat kid, and I was looking at all the snack cakes, and I got mesmerized by Hostess and by Twinkies and by Little Debbie. And I looked around, and I looked up, and my mom and dad weren't there. I had no idea where they were. And so I did what any normal young kid did. I began to scream, "Mommy! Daddy!" I had people rush to me and say, "Help me." And I just started running and looking for them. And all of a sudden, through the crowd, I heard a familiar voice. It was the voice of my Father calling out. And in the midst of the chaos, not knowing where to turn, it was the voice of my Father that I could trust and run to. And that is what we can do today. See, Daniel didn't listen to the voice of Babylon. He followed the voice of God. And we don't have to worry. We don't have to fear. We don't have to turn away because of the circumstances we face. We can listen to the voice of our Father. That familiar voice that says, "I'm in control. I've got this. You can trust me." See, as Daniel looked around him, his situation might have looked hopeless, but he knew where his hope lied. It was in the hands of his God. His hope was not in his plan. It was not in his own ability. It was not in his own strength. It was in the Lord. He had resolved to follow the Lord, and God was in control, and he was going to trust Him. And because of that, God used Daniel in mighty, mighty ways. You see that in the rest of the book. That this wisdom and this ability that God had given Daniel was used by God to bring Himself glory in the kingdom of Babylon. Where are you today? What situation do you find yourself where compromising looks promising? Where it'd be easy to take the easy way out? Where it'd be easy to go with the world and away from God? Remember this truth. God is on His throne. He is in control, and you can turn to Him and trust Him. God is sovereign and in control over every circumstances. Because of this, we can trust Him. Will you trust Him today? Will you trust Him for salvation? Will you trust Him daily as you walk with Him? Trust Him.